I'm going to give you a little, I'm mixing metaphors here. I'm going to give you a peek behind the curtain. And I'm also going to show you a little bit how the sermon sausage is made. And that is, most of the time I'm a lectionary preacher. And the lectionary, every Sunday, there are 4 passages of Scripture. There's always an Old Testament reading, a psalm, a gospel reading, and an epistle. In other words, everything else in the New Testament other than the Gospels. Those 4 are offered every Sunday. And those of us that are lectionary preachers, every week we look at those 4 and decide we're going to base our sermon on one of those. And when you preach every week, you've got to be disciplined about it, at least I do. So I'm normally not working ahead. I normally start the process on Monday. I know this is incredibly interesting to you, but there's a point here that I'll eventually, hopefully, get to. And that is, I always start with the gospel reading. I have to say, probably 90+% of the time I go with the gospel. Well, on Monday, I looked at what the gospel reading was, and I just didn't like it. In fact, I didn't like it so much that I don't even remember what it is. I don't remember. And I read all the other ones, and I was still vibrating. The adult class last Sunday when we talked about God, I enjoyed the class. I enjoyed the book very much. I enjoyed the Borg's book very much. I was still vibrating God. So I went with Psalm 95 because that psalm talks about God. And then I thought, okay, we're in Lent. And Lent is supposed to be a time of study, a time of reflection, a time of contemplation. And I thought of one of my favorite words. One of my favorite words is muse, M-U-S-E. And I looked it up just to be sure what the definition of muse is, and that is to consider something. When you muse, you are considering something thoughtfully. It's where we get the word museum. We go to museums to consider things thoughtfully. So this is sort of a sermon, but it's more of a muse. I'm inviting you to muse with me, to think thoughtfully about God. And at the end of it, I hope that the rest of today, and maybe even the rest of your life, is that asking too much? That we spend the rest of our lives thinking about God, wondering. And I spent all week studying everything I could find about God. All week. And it changed nothing. I said that negatively just to kind of be dramatic. It changed nothing except it made even more clear to me what I've always thought is the best way to find God. And that's when I'm ready to be done today, I'll tell you that. The best way, I think, to find God, and I'm not alone. There are people a lot smarter than me that agree with me. And also, since it's not a sermon, it's more muse, you should be very, very afraid right now. I have about 15 pieces of paper in my hand. I'm ready for an hour at least. But I've got my watch, and pardon my vanity, I'm pretty good at knowing what time it is. Not every preacher is, right? So I won't go an hour. I'll at least say that. The first thing I thought of, the first muse that came to mind was a memory. Many, many years ago, I was the associate pastor of a Presbyterian church in suburban Chicago. It had a thriving youth ministry program. And when you have a thriving youth ministry program, you have a lot of young parents that are members of your church. And Ron and Dodie was a member. They had 2 kids. Dodie was a member. Ron was not. And they were just a delightful couple, and I got to know them both. Dodie came to church with the kids every Sunday. Ron came occasionally. He was a great guy. And honest to God, this happened verbatim. One day after church, Ron, who was not a member, said to me, he goes, "Man, Jay, I really like this church. I really like it. My family loves it." He said, I'd love to join, but I have one problem. And I said, "What's that, Ron?" And he said, I'm not sure I believe in God. And what do you do with that as a minister? You know, I immediately knew what I was going to say, and I said it. And I don't know if it was right, I don't know if it was wrong, but it was the truth. He said, "I'm not sure I believe in God." And I said, "Ron, listen, why don't you join and we'll work that out later." And I meant it. And we did. God. Here's another muse. I shared this with the class. I'm going to share it again. I have a theory that when children, speaking as a child of the church, as a preacher's kid, I think that it is communicated to us usually indirectly and often non-verbally as we're beginning our spiritual journeys. I think that we are taught that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. The 3 O's. I think that that's where most of us start. And by the way, that's where a lot of adults still are. And that's okay, I guess. Omnipotent. We are taught that God is all-powerful, right? Omnipotent. Omniscient. We are taught that God knows everything. And omnipresent. We are taught that God is always present. And I'm going to tell you what I believe. I believe that with God, all things are possible. And if you ask me if I think God is all-powerful, omnipotent, I'm going to tell you, if God is omnipotent, God's omnipotent in a way that I don't understand. See how I didn't really say yes or no? If God is all-powerful, God is all-powerful in a way that I don't understand. I've seen too much, and so have you, to think that God's all-powerful in a way that I can understand. So I don't know about that one. Omniscient. Is God all-knowing? Does God know what I'm going to do later on this afternoon? Does God know that at 2 o'clock I'm going to sit down and watch the Women's Big Ten Championship game on TV? Does God know this? I don't know. If God knows everything in a way that I don't understand. And finally, omnipresent. Omnipresent. Is God always present? I can answer that one. Yes. Yes. God is always present. Now, what if somebody says, "Prove it"? What am I going to say? I'm going to say, "I can't." But I believe it. In 1953, J.B. Phillips wrote a book that became kind of a bestseller, certainly a bestseller among those on spiritual journeys. In 1953, he wrote a book entitled "Your God is Too Small." And he talked about people's concepts of God. He talked about how language limits us. And it can be, well, your God is too small. If you can put, for example, one of the ways he described God was God in a box. If you can put your concept of God in a box, your God is too small. He also said that a lot of people live with a God images called grand old man, thinking of God as a grand old man. Here's one of my favorites. God as resident policeman. God as resident policeman. God as absolute perfection. God as parental hangover. Your God is too small. 1953. Here's another muse that I want to lift up. I see what time it is. And I've shared this with you before, and I really like this one. You have to use your imagination. God is a circle whose circumference is nowhere and center is everywhere. The definition of God that drives engineers crazy. God is and mathematicians. God is a circle whose circumference goes on for infinity, and the center is everywhere, also goes on in infinity. You know, I just remembered this. You know what one of the tests of fame in our society is? It's either fame or infamy, but you know you're well known if you have a Wikipedia article written about you. Right? I had never done this before in my ministry. I wanted to see if God had a Wikipedia article. Is God well known enough to have a Wikipedia article? What do you think? Anybody want to guess? Yes. I read it. The whole thing. I read the whole thing. It's like 20 pages or so. And then there's like 20 more pages of footnotes and references, if you want to know more. And when I'm done, I'm going to be done in about 5 minutes or so. When I'm done, I'll tell you what the bottom line is for me. Another one of my favorite musings about God is, and this is original with me, I'm not the only one who's ever thought this, but this one came to me and me alone many years ago. One of my favorite definitions of God is a 2-word sentence with a period at the end of it. And that is this: God is. I believe that. God is. 1 John 4, verse 8. 1 John 4, verse 8. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. 1 John 4:16, God is love, and whoever lives in love lives in God, and God lives in them. As we were singing the opening hymn, they will know we are Christians by our love. I thought of recent decisions to go to war. While we were singing, I couldn't get the images out of my mind. I was seeing bombs going off, and and the music I was hearing was, they will know we are Christians by our love. God, show us how to bring love and justice into this world. Okay, now we're getting very, very close. Very close. Paul Tillich said that the best way to think of God is think of God as the ground of all being. We're getting closer now. He said, think of God as the ground of all being. We're getting very close, very close. And Mark Buber, in his book on the Bible, writes about the burning bush. And he reminds us of that Hebrew phrase. You remember the burning bush, what I believe was the beginning of Judeo-Christian tradition. Moses, who was on the lam murdering an Egyptian. And the only person that would give him a job was his father-in-law, to tend sheep. Moses was out by himself on Mount Horeb, which is desert-like, dirt, rocks, scorpions, and he sees a bush burning that is not being consumed by the flames. And a voice comes from the bush saying, "Moses, take off your shoes. The ground on which you stand is holy." The Hebrew word is kodesh, holy, and it's the first time the word appears in the Bible, all the way into Exodus. It does not appear when Eden is described. This is the first time we have a concept of holiness on a mountain. Take off your shoes. The ground on which you stand is holy. And God and Moses have a conversation. God is trying to convince Moses to go to Egypt to free the people. Moses doesn't want to do it because Moses has a brain. You're asking too much. Moses finally starts to crack a little bit. He says, all right, essentially he says, all right, if I do this, and Pharaoh asks, who has sent me, tell me what to say. In other words, Moses is saying, what's your name? And God answers, in Hebrew, Ahyeh, Asher, Ahyeh. And nobody really knows what this means. But really smart people like Martin Buber thinks they do. And he makes a case of it, and he essentially says the name of God is I am present, and I always will be. And Buber goes on to say it's really sort of ridiculous to ask God to be present, because God always is. Ahyeh, Asher, Ahyeh. Okay, now I'm ready. I spent a week of my life on your behalf to muse about God. And I really didn't learn anything new, but what I really believe was fortified and solidified. And Borg talks about it in his book, and that's why the title of this message is the title of the chapter that talks about God. The title is The Heart of Reality. Borg says that God is the heart of our reality. And here it is. This is my big takeaway. Not only after a week of study, but 40 years of ministry. My takeaway is, if you want to find God, look within. Look within. Ahyeh, Asher, Ahyeh. The heart of reality. Amen?